Okay, let's do this. All right. So today's date is July 27th. What does that mean? Well, on this date in 1953, the armistice was signed that brought an end to the hostilities that were occurring as part of the Korean War. Now, what it did not do was end the Korean War because that would require a peace treaty, which, to be honest, as of yet has not occurred. All right. So, what exactly is an armistice? And then we'll talk a little bit more about why this is significant and what this means. Well, we know what a ceasefire is. Okay. So, a ceasefire is exactly what it sounds like. You have some sort of arrangement or agreement between two sides that they are going to, bring about a cessation of the hostilities. It is literally they are going to cease firing at one another. Um, a truce would be a similar kind of statement to a ceasefire. So, okay, well, then what is the difference between a ceasefire or a truce and an armistice? Well, an armistice is a little bit more formal. So it is a ceasefire that has been formalized through some sort of negotiated arrangement that is then typically signed by military commanders. All right. So, in that way, it is more formal than a ceasefire. It's a more formalized type of ceasefire, but it is still not a peace treaty. The difference between an armistice and a peace treaty is that an armistice is signed by military commanders. A peace treaty would typically be signed by heads of state. It supersedes an armistice and is the type of documentation that would be required to actually say that, such and such war has ended. It is a peace treaty. All right. So we tend to say that the Korean War was fought between June of 1950 and July of 1953. Technically, the Korean War has not ended. It still persists to this day, which would make it a very, very long war, because we still have not gotten to the point of a peace treaty. So does that mean that technically we, if I'm talking from the perspective of us here in the United States, are we still at war with North Korea? Well, there's been no peace treaty. Though we did never actually formally declare war on North Korea either. In fact, the what would become known as the Korean War was initially sold to the American public as a police action. Okay, so let's talk through this very briefly. I don't think there's going to be a brief video, but let's at least get to the armistice portion. So let's briefly cover what happened, how the war broke out, to get to how at least the hostilities ended. So in the summer of 1950, so June 25th, 1950, the war breaks out. And at least in the West, the generally accepted narrative is that North Korea invaded South Korea. Now, do the North Koreans have their version of events? Yes, they do. They do have their version of events. And in fact, I do have a book which I have read that's called what is it called? It's called the US imperialists started the Korean War, and it is kind of the North Korean version of events. But anyway, so in the West, the accepted narrative of how that started is that North Korea invades South Korea. And then immediately the United States gets involved, but so do a bunch of other nations, and this is done under the banner of the United Nations. In fact, there is this command, this umbrella command, the United Nations Command, that fights on the side of South Korea to repel the North Korean invaders. North Korea would be assisted by China. So does that mean China declared war on the United States and other nations? No, they what they did was they didn't employ their PLA, the People's Liberation Army. What they did was they took a bunch of troops, called them volunteers, what is typically referred to as the CPV, the Chinese People's Volunteers, and had them assist North Korea in the war. And so in that way, they were able to keep a little bit of kind of diplomatic distance between what their soldiers were doing. supposedly as volunteers, and what their actual army, the PLA, would be doing on behalf of the Chinese government. Now, were CPV troops just troops that had come from the PLA? Yes. All right. Anyway, so yeah, the war is fought on the one side by North Korea and the Chinese People's Volunteers, and on the other side by South Korea, assisted by a whole host of nations, to include the United States and troops from many other nations as well, that were fighting under the banner of United Nations Command. Now, this is interesting because you got to remember, so this is 1950. This is just a couple of years after the end of World War II, the formation of the United Nations. But if you think that the United Nations was acting as some sort of like third party arbiter between the two groups of belligerents, you'd be wrong. They were a belligerent. They were the umbrella command of belligerents on one side of the conflict. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at something. I'm going to go through this. If you want to know more about the Korean War itself, how it was fought, how exactly it started, at some point I will probably do a video on that, and there are plenty of other sources you can go to as well for that. But that's not exactly what we're going to talk through today. But I do want to share this because today we're going to talk about the armistice. All right. So here we go. You'll see here. Then I'll put this link in the description. But this is from a DoD website. But anybody can go here and look at this. And this is from a couple of years ago, so 2 years ago. But this article here marked the 70th anniversary of the signing of the armistice. Obviously, it's been 2 more years now. So anyway, we're not going to read through this, but it does just say here, the Korean Armistice Agreement, signed on July 27th, 1953, today's date, was the culmination of many months of bickering between officials from the United States, North Korea, South Korea, China, the former Soviet Union, and United Nations forces. All right, so you can see a photo there, and then this very famous photo here. And when I say it's famous, if you're not familiar with Korea or the Korean War or the armistice, then yeah, maybe you've never seen this photo. But if you are familiar with those things, then you may have seen this photo in the past. It is probably the most well-known photo, at least in circulation in the United States, I would say, from the signing of the armistice. So what exactly is taking place in this photo? So you have 2 people who are signing the document. Let me back up a step. So the war starts in June of 1950. After about a year of very brutal fighting, in the winter in Korea, from 1950 to 1951, that winter, so the first winter of the war, was exceptionally brutal, horrific fighting. So 1 year into the war, the summer of 1951, after a brutal year of fighting, the 2 sides entered into negotiations, but it would take them an additional 2 years of negotiation before they would actually sign the armistice. Okay, so when this is signed on July 27, 1953, you've had 3 years of fighting and 2 years of bitter negotiations to get to this point. So who do we have here? If you can see my cursor, you have this gentleman right here, General Harrison. Okay, and then this gentleman right here. So this is a U.S. general, General Harrison. This is General Nam-il. So he's a North Korean general. So they are seated at 2 different tables, and they are signing their respective copies of the armistice. This is at 10 a.m. on July 27th. As they are signing this in this room, and as the story goes, they don't say anything to each other. They don't shake hands. They don't do anything. They don't even acknowledge each other. They each sign their document. They leave, but while they're signing, in the distance, artillery fire could be heard. So they sign this at 10 in the morning. It will formally go into effect 12 hours later at 12 p.m. on the same day. But anyway, I'll link this in if you want to read through this little, short little article. It's pretty interesting. But I did just want to sum this up here. So the armistice was signed by U.S. Army Lieutenant General William Harrison Jr., that's who we just saw in the photo, and U.S. Army General Mark Clark, representing the United Nations Command. So how does that happen? Why does it have two names here? So General Harrison signs the armistice in the morning, okay, at the same time that General Nam Il is signing for the North Koreans. Okay, they sign at the same time, 10 a.m. in the morning. The armistice will go into effect formally 12 hours later. Each respective side, though, will then have their respective commanders sign at their own ceremonies, a couple hours later, but not together. So this is where you had senior delegates from each side signing the document together in the same place at the same time. But he is not the commander of the United Nations Command. He is not the commander of what's called the KPA, the North Korean People's Army. KPA means Korean People's Army, but it specifically means, in this case, the North Koreans. So who's the commander-in-chief of the Korean People's Army? That would be Kim Il-sung, who's also the head of state. But he would sign in the afternoon on this same day. He would sign in his capacity as the commander-in-chief for the military, not in his capacity as the head of state. That's important. Why? Because this is an armistice. It is not a peace treaty. So this is the initial signing in the morning, and then the respective commanders would sign separately later on in the afternoon. So that's why it says here at the bottom that Lieutenant General William Harrison Jr. signed, but it also mentions Army General. So this is a 3-star, a lieutenant general. This is a 4-star. He's the commander. This is Mark W. Clark, and he would sign as the United Nations commander later on in the day. All right, so what did the armistice do? It established the demilitarized zone. It put into force a ceasefire and finalized the repatriation of prisoners of war who wish to be repatriated. Now, I talked about this in my previous video that I did on Korea a while back, not too long ago, but I don't know, a month or so ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. I can't remember exactly when it was. So I don't want to cover the exact same stuff. There will be a little bit of overlap, but if this interests you at all and you didn't go check out that video, I would recommend you go check out that video too, because there's a lot of super interesting stuff in that video that you probably don't know about what goes on up in the demilitarized zone. And I shared an article written by a good friend of mine that I know and that I knew in Korea and that I knew in other units in the Army. But also in that video, I kind of give you some personal perspectives from my time in the demilitarized zone and from the occasion in which we conducted a joint inspection of a certain part of the demilitarized zone with the North Koreans. We had to cross over onto the North Korean side of the DMZ. So I kind of talk all about that in that other video. Okay, so let's get rid of that and let's go here. Because I do want to grab something else. Okay, so let's look at this one. Again, I'll give you the link to all of these. This is from the Army War College website. It's called the Korean War Armistice, a Battlefield Negotiation. But here's another photo here. So you can read through this, but I wanted to read one of the paragraphs here, and I also wanted to show you this photo. So this is General Mark Clark. So the armistice is signed in the morning by both sides, senior delegates, and then it would later be signed by the respective sides' commanders. So this is the signing ceremony for United Nations Command. This is the United Nations Command commander, Mark Clark, as he is signing the document. So let's see what it says here. A strong wind buffeted Panmunjom, Korea, the morning of July 27, 1953. So what's Panmunjom? So it's this area right there. When if people don't know anything about the DMZ, but they do have some sort of picture as to what it looks like because they feel like they've seen images of it or something before, they are almost assuredly thinking about the Joint Security Area, which is in Panmunjom, which is just one part of the DMZ, but it is kind of the center of gravity of the DMZ. It's not the geographic center of the DMZ. It's much further west, but but it is kind of located like in between Seoul and Pyongyang. And it is the vicinity of where a lot of the negotiations took place, and remains to be the center of gravity for the DMZ to this day. Anyway, so a strong wind buffeted Panmunjom, Korea, the morning of July 27, 1953, carrying the sound of artillery firing from miles away, a reminder of ongoing hostilities. The Korean War that had raged for 3 years was not yet over. At 10 o'clock, this means in the morning, the two senior delegates representing the belligerents, U.S. Army Lieutenant General William K. Harrison, United Nations Command, and General Nam Il on behalf of the Korea's People's Armies, the Korea's People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers Coalition walked into a specially constructed building. They did not acknowledge each other, but immediately started signing the Armistice Agreement. So that's represented in the photo we just looked at. Minutes later, they rose from their seats and wordlessly left the building. That afternoon, the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, U.S. Army General Mark Clark, countersigned the documents at Munsan in the Republic of Korea. His communist coalition counterparts would do the same thing in North Korean territory. The ceasefire would go into effect at 10 p.m., and with it, the guns fell silent after nearly 200 negotiating sessions and 400 hours of discussions over the span of 2 years and 17 days. The armistice still holds 70 years after its military signatories agreed to it. All right, so again, this is General Clark signing sometime in the afternoon of July 27th. Okay. So 2 years of negotiations to finally get this thing signed. While these negotiations are happening, fighting is still raging. Right? They get this thing signed. Now, generally when an armistice is signed, it's a bridging solution to bridge the gap so you can kind of get to the eventual peace treaty. That has not yet happened. 7 decades and running here with this situation. Think about the example of World War I, for example, right? So another very famous armistice signed on November 11th. Remember, it was signed at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So November 11th, 1918, that was an armistice. You know, that day that we in the United States now refer to as Veterans Day used to be known as Armistice Day for a long time. But that armistice was only in effect until the following summer. So in the following summer, in June of 1919, the peace treaty, which was known as the Treaty of Versailles, was actually signed. So that armistice was in effect for 7.5 months. I think it was signed towards the end of June 1919. So think about 7 months, 7.5 months compared to now 70 plus years, 72 years. So it is interesting because, you could try to put yourself into the shoes of those who were conducting the negotiations or were the commanders of the respective sides. And what did they think about what was going on? And could they have ever conceived that during their lifetimes or the lifetimes of their, children, probably, this still would not would still not yield a peace treaty, right? So what was the thought? So if you were on the side of United States troops, from what I've read and from what I understand, there was mixed emotions. Why? You're glad that the fighting is over because it was bitter. It was bitter all 3 years. And remember, the United States lost about 35,000 soldiers in Korea. But so you're glad the fighting is over, but there's also this sense that what was gained. We're not going home victorious. It largely ended in a stalemate. In fact, the actual battle lines basically ended roughly where they had kind of started, you know? So a lot of people viewed it as a stalemate, except with a lot of people that were killed on both sides. Now, there is kind of this interesting little booklet. All right. So this interesting little booklet is called How Communists Negotiate. All right. And it is an interesting little book. So anyway, I don't know if you can see that there, but the author, so let's see if we can put that there where you can see it's kind of small. Right there's the name. Admiral C Admiral C. Turner Joy. Okay. Admiral C. Turner Joy. So he was obviously a naval officer. So he participated in these negotiations towards the armistice for United Nations Command. Now, he's kind of an interesting character. If we just talk about his name for a moment. So Admiral Turner Joy would have a ship named for him. So the USS Turner Joy, they would actually be involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, like a decade later. What was that, 1964? So anyway, but okay, so what exactly is this little booklet? So the story behind this little booklet, get it, read it, draw your own conclusions. If you think this is just, one side propaganda, then okay, cool, whatever. That's great. But the story behind this is that those who participated in the negotiations towards the Korean Armistice wanted to create a document for those who would then participate later on in the negotiations as part of the Vietnamese or the Vietnam. So I'm going to read something here. So that's why. So now in the midst of Vietnam, these guys were like, "Hey, we've got some experience with this," and I'm looking at the year that so the copyright year here is 1970. So Vietnam is happening, dragging on. Still, we're in the middle of the Cold War, but it's another hot manifestation of the Cold War. And so you got these guys that participated in the negotiations during the Korean War that are saying we should put what we learn on paper for these guys who might have to participate in these negotiations with the North Vietnamese. So here's what it says in the foreword. On January 25th, 1969, there began in Paris, in the guise of Vietnamese peace talks, a concrete demonstration of the wisdom of Matthew Henry's commentary, quote, "None so blind as those who will not see," unquote. The locale was Paris rather than Kaesong, which is in North Korea, or Panmunjom, which I just talked about. The cast of characters comprised North Vietnamese and Viet Cong versus the South Vietnamese and Americans, instead of North Koreans and Red Chinese versus South Koreans and Americans acting in the name of the United Nations. But otherwise, the frustrating farce in Paris has been a virtual replay of the Korean truce talks, which began in Kaesong on July 10th, 1951, and dragged on for more than 2 years. The mistakes our side made during the Korean truce talks were many and varied, but were perhaps excusable on the ground of our inexperience in dealing with communists and our natural reluctance to believe it possible for human beings to be so inhumanly perfidious. Those of us who took part in these encounters, and every meeting was a battle, learned a great lesson. We saw at firsthand how a man's mind may be distorted by accepting a philosophy that denies everything which we were taught. I'm sorry, hold on. We saw at firsthand how a man's mind can be distorted by accepting a philosophy that denies everything which we were taught constitutes the eternal verities. We learned this lesson the hard way by experience. So what he's saying is, all right, we went into these negotiations with the North Koreans blind, because how do you negotiate with somebody who denies everything that you hold as an eternal truth? So we had to learn the hard way through bitter experience. Every what does he say? Every meeting was a battle. But you guys can learn from our experiences. So that's kind of why this book was written. So anyway, pretty interesting book. Now, I've said this before, and I don't want to go into this, too much here, but it is an interesting book. You can draw your own conclusions as to what you think about it or whatever. I'm not here to defend communism, right? So I think that there probably is a certain way in which communists negotiate. And it must be very difficult to probably negotiate with them. That I get. Now, what do I think about the Korean War, and what do I think about, powerful players manipulating both sides? Yes, I think that was probably happening. I think that still happens to this day. I think that's part of the reason why we still have this dialectical tension between the East and the West, and North Korea clearly plays a role in that. But that doesn't mean that the negotiations that were happening from 1951 to 1953 weren't a real struggle, there on the ground, as it were. They may have been. All right. So I still think that there's something that can be taken from learning how those who, deny these eternal truths think and would come to a negotiation table. Because here's the thing. I think that this idea of communism is far more rampant than just the North Koreans or the North Vietnamese, during those respective wars or whatever. So anyway, I throw that out there for something interesting that you can look at. What I want to do next, and I don't want to spend a lot of time doing this because you can always go find this on your own. But I want to show you the text of the armistice. I will give you a link where you can find this. It's actually pretty easy to find. I'm going to show you two versions of the text. So this one, okay, so you can see this here. All right. So it's not that great of a copy. I mean, obviously it's legible, but it's slightly crooked. But you can find this. So this is the full text in English of the Armistice Agreement. And I used to have a little booklet of this when I was stationed in Korea, because I was part of the secretariat for the United Nations Command side of the Military Armistice Commission. So we used to have to dig into this all the time. So anyway, so what do we got here? So we've got, all right, preamble. The undersigned, the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command on the one hand, and the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, which is Kim Il-sung, and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers on the other hand, in the interest of stopping the Korean conflict with its great toll of suffering and bloodshed on both sides, and with the objective of establishing an armistice which will ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed forces in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. We still haven't gotten to that. Do individually, collectively, and mutually agree to accept and to be bound and governed by the conditions and terms of armistice set forth in the following articles and paragraphs, which said conditions and terms are intended to be purely military in character and pertain solely to the belligerents in Korea. This is a military document. This is not a peace treaty. A peace treaty would supersede this. This is purely military in character. It is signed. It is negotiated by military officers. It is signed by military commanders. So Article 1 creates the military demarcation line in the demilitarized zone. I went through this in the last video. But the military demarcation line, the MDL, is what we would typically referred to as like a border. It is the border. It is the actual line between North Korea and South Korea. Okay. Therefore, it is the middle of the DMZ. The DMZ is 4 kilometers north to south. So it's 4 kilometers wide or deep, if you prefer. And it runs the span of the entire width or the entire span of the Korean Peninsula, east to west, right? And so from north to south, it's 4 kilometers, which is about 2.5 miles wide, and then spanning the entire uh, width of the peninsula would make it about like 150 miles. So the way the DMZ the way it works is from the MDL, the military demarcation line, which is the middle line, the actual border, if you were to reduce it down to one line between the north and the south. So from that line, 2 kilometers north, that is the northern half of the DMZ. That side of the DMZ is belongs to North Korea and is administered by North Korea. From the MDL south, 2 kilometers would be the southern half of the demilitarized zone, and that would be South Korean territory. And this is where it gets a little bit crazy because you got some real issues about sovereignty. And I don't remember if I explained this in the other video or how I did, but this gets real tricky because, and people explain this different ways, because it's a little bit subjective, and maybe people would not like for me to use that word, but it is, and it causes a lot of problems because I remember when I was in Korea, I know that there were times that I probably said things like, well, the southern half of the DMZ, because it's controlled by the United Nations commander, the United Nations command commander, which it is by the armistice, I would say things like, it's not sovereign South Korean territory. But that's not accurate. I know I said that at times when I was stationed in Korea, and I was there from 2017 to 2020. That's not exactly accurate, though. It would be more accurate to say it still remains South Korean territory. So, like from a de jure standpoint, yeah, they still retain that sovereignty. But in a more de facto sense, that's where it's like a little bit more open-ended, because on a daily basis, it's still South Korean territory. That's not in dispute. But that southern part of the DMZ from the MDL 2 kilometers south is controlled by the United Nations Command, not by the South Korean government. And who controls it on behalf of the United Nations Command commander? What's called the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission Secretariat, which is the small organization that I worked for the first 2 years that I was in South Korea, which is why I know a lot about this. And I spent a lot of time up there in the DMZ, and we would have people, constantly stationed there, et cetera. But the United Nations Command commander controls who can and cannot enter the DMZ. That's why I say it gets real tricky as to who owns that. But if I ever said, well, I was in Korea, and I'm pretty sure I did, that it's not sovereign South Korean territory, I don't think that's exactly accurate. South Korea still retains, like de jure sovereignty. I'm not a lawyer, but that's just how I'm going to say it. Of that territory, but it is controlled on a daily basis by United Nations Command. Now that gets tricky. I mean, obviously there can be some tension there, So yeah, it's something that the government in Seoul and United Nations Command have had to figure out over the last, 70 years, 72 years. All right. So anyway, so this part of the document, Article 1 establishes the MDL and the DMZ. So let's just go down here. We're not going to read this. You can go check this out if you're really interested. Article 2, concrete arrangements for a ceasefire and armistice. Hey, we got to get the shooting to stop. How do we do that? Okay, Military Armistice Commission. So we are going to set up a commission, like a joint commission on each side of senior officers that can work together to ensure that each side respectively, implements and maintains this armistice and then investigates any violations that their side or the other side might commit. And I worked for the secretariat that would kind of perform a lot of the staff work for this Military Armistice Commission on the United Nations command side. Okay, so this kind of goes through the functions and authority of the Military Armistice Commission. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. All right, so here's the next part. So the establishment of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. So this is super interesting, right? So you have an armistice that it took you 2 years to negotiate. 3 years of fighting, 2 years of intense negotiation. You create like a bilateral military armistice commission, which is going to be comprised of some senior officers over here and some senior officers over here, and they can come together and discuss, talk through issues, but they are created. The armistice creates that commission to ensure that each side maintains the armistice, right? Well, who watches the Military Armistice Commission? So the armistice also created what's known as the NNSC, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. So what is this? Because you may not know this. You may have never heard about this. You might find this interesting. The Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission shall be composed of 4 senior officers, 2 of whom shall be appointed by neutral nations, nominated by the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, namely Sweden and Switzerland, and 2 whom shall be appointed by neutral nations, nominated jointly by the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, namely Poland and Czechoslovakia. The term neutral nations, as herein used, is defined as those nations whose combatant forces have not participated in the hostilities in Korea. All right. So the armistice says, hey, we're going to form this other commission that has this outside role. It's going to be composed of several senior officers from the militaries from these neutral nations, and they can provide oversight to the Military Armistice Commission of each side. All right, well, who gets to pick what nations are going to be part of this Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission? And the answer that they came up with was, you pick 2 and I'll pick 2. So basically, United Nations Command, you pick 2 countries, and then, together between the North Korea and the Chinese People's Volunteers, they would pick 2 others. So from the United Nations Command side, they picked Sweden and Switzerland. And then from the other side, the North Koreans in the CPV, they picked Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now, some of you, remember this is 1953, some of you will be like, hey, Czechoslovakia doesn't even exist as a country anymore. And that's right. That's right. We'll talk about that here in a moment. All right, so it talks about what the NNSC does. So anyway, all right, arrangements relating to prisoners of war. So we talked about this in the other video with Little Switch and Big Switch, the bridge of no return. So anyway, so I'm just going to go down through here. Article 4, recommendation to the governments concerned on both sides. Article 5, miscellaneous. All right, I did want to show you these signatures. So what do you have down here? So this is where you have the signatures of Nam Il and William K. Harrison. These are the 2 guys who signed at 10 o'clock in the morning, right? So General, Korean People's Army, Senior Delegate. William K. Harrison, Jr., Lieutenant General, United States Army, Senior Delegate. Okay, so they're representing their respective sides. But then up here, who do you have? Kim Il-sung, Marshal, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Supreme Commander, Korean People's Army. These are military terms. Remember what I said. He is signing in his capacity as, the Commander-in-Chief or the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, not as head of state, okay? Even Marshal is a military term. This guy, Peng Tae-wai, Commander, Chinese People's Volunteers, volunteers. And Mark W. Clark, General, United States Army, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command. Now, who do you not see here? You don't see anybody from South Korea. There is no South Korean general's name on here. There is also no South Korean leader who says, so who was the head of state of South Korea at the time? Syngman Rhee. So neither he signed it in some sort of military capacity, and none of his commanding generals signed it. Why? Syngman Rhee was opposed to the armistice. Why? Because he wanted total reunification of the peninsula. So he was opposed to this armistice, but he would not obstruct it. So that's interesting, and that will come into play. We're going to talk about this in a couple minutes, because all this plays into what has happened over the last 70 plus years and where we are now. So Syngman Rhee would not sign the armistice, but he also would not obstruct its implementation. And he was under significant political pressure that was coming from the United States, etc. But his signature is nowhere on here. There's no signature from any South Korean on here. North Korean, North Korean, American, American, Chinese. These guys are representing North Korea. This guy's representing the Chinese People's Volunteers, not necessarily the Chinese military, not the PLA, but the CPV, if you believe that there's a distinction there, but, China believed there was a distinction. These guys are Americans, but they are representing United Nations Command. Okay. So I'm going to just show you one more. If you're at all interested, you can read through the text of the armistice in, I don't know, probably an hour or so. It's not long. So if you want to find text that's maybe a little bit more readable than that, then I'll give you another link and you can read maybe something that's like a little bit more easily read. So I'll show you this. So this is just from the National Archives. Here's the Armistice Agreement for the restoration of the. So So anyway, you can. There's kind of some just some good context here, So there's some good context here if you want to read through, but then if you go down here, this is where you can actually read the transcript or the entire text of the armistice, and maybe it's a little bit more legible than what we were just looking at. So you can go through here. It's the same thing that we just looked at, so it's just the text. So, but this is interesting because if you look here, it only has the two signatures of the gentleman who signed in the morning at 10 a.m. in Panmunjom. So Nam Il and William K. Harrison. Okay. All right. So what I want to talk about, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want to show you this interesting book here. So I got this when I was in Korea, and I got it from the author who served on the Military Armistice Commission. So he wrote this book, and it's pretty interesting because it's actually written in English and Korean. So you can kind of see it in both languages there. It's pretty cool, right? If you can see that. Yeah, kind of cool, right? I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, so pretty cool. So he was a Korean 2-star general, and his name was Major General Shin Sang-bum. And so he was one of these generals that was part of the Military Armistice Commission on the side of the United Nations Command. So what he wanted to do was, he says here, and we're just going to read a couple of things from this, but he says, as the senior member of the United Nations Command and Military Armistice Commission, I wanted to help non-military readers better understand the changes and transformation of the security environment on the Korean Peninsula by writing a simple and easy-to-follow book that explains such topics as the Korean War, the establishment of United Nations Command, the implementation of the Armistice Agreement, the 2018 inter-Korean agreements between the two leaders, and the comprehensive military agreement for the implementation of the Panmunjom Declaration. I talked about some of that in the previous video. The year 2018 marked a new beginning of peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. That's true. I was there then. We're not going to talk a lot about that here, but he wrote this book in 2019. So he had seen a lot of that. All right, so let's go through, because there are kind of some interesting things here that I'll share with you. All right, so the armistice. The Korean War, which broke out on June 25th, 1950, with an unprovoked invasion of South Korea by North Korea. That's the generally accepted narrative. North Korea's got their version, but I mean, this is a South Korean general, writing this. And that's the narrative in the West too, obviously. Caused numerous human, and I'm not here to say, I'm not saying that's untrue. I'm just letting you know there are alternate narratives out there if you choose to look at those. I mean, there's another book. I mean, I mentioned the book that's many people would probably just say it's straight up North Korean propaganda, and that's fine. That's true. That doesn't mean that I won't read it. When I was in Korea, I wanted to know what the North Korean propaganda was. But there's another book that I have that's called The Hidden History of the Korean War. Yeah, I.F. Stone. That's who I thought was the author. I mean, that kind of gives a counter narrative as to how the Korean War started. I.F. Stone, The Hidden History of the Korean War. Read that, draw your own conclusions, or just read them and just say, okay, this is cool. These two narratives are in tension, and then you can decide what to do with that. Okay. The war caused numerous human casualties and property losses, lasted for 3 years until an armistice was signed. To conclude this devastating war peacefully, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, by General Mark W. Clark, Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, Marshal Kim Il-sung, Democratic People's Republic of Korea Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, and Peng Dehuai, Commander of Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV. Okay. He goes on to say, since its signing, the Armistice Agreement has been the standard for maintaining military order on the Korean Peninsula for both South and North Korea. Now, this is interesting because, so it's interesting. So we tend to say, and I don't know if this is just like an American thing, a Western thing, something we do in English or whatever, but we tend to say, if you're gonna talk in terms of the couplet North and South, you tend to say it in that order, North and South. If I'm gonna say East and West, I generally will say it in that order, East and West. Even if I'm speaking geopolitically and I'm from the West, I still generally will say East and West as opposed to West and East. I just find it kind of funny and enlightening that he says here, for both South and North Korea. And I think that's pretty typical for South Koreans. And I'm sure North Koreans do the same thing. But there's an interesting note here that I will tell you, because this will give you some insights into the and by the way, I'm not saying that's bad, by the way. I mean, it's okay to start from the perspective of yourself and your people first. I'm from North Carolina. All right. That's where I grew up. If I were to refer to North Carolina and its sister state, I would say North and South Carolina. If I were South Carolinian, which I'm not, and I were to refer to both states, would I say South and North Carolina? I don't know. I don't think so. Ask a South Carolinian. Anyway, so both governments, the government in Seoul, sees itself as the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. The government in Pyongyang sees itself as the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Okay, remember, Syngman Rhee, South Korean leader, didn't even want to sign the armistice because he wanted reunification. And remember, it's neither North Korea nor South Korea's fault that the Korean peninsula was divided. I believe I explained this in the previous video, but they had been occupied by Japan. And so as part of coming out of World War II, the Allies took Korea from Japan and then split it, just like happened with Germany. But Korea wasn't a belligerent in World War II, unlike Germany. So it's very, very strange. But it was split north-south, whereas Germany was split east-west. And just as East Germany kind of became this was basically administrated by the Soviet Union, whereas West Germany kind of fell under the protective shield of the other Western powers. Then you get one that becomes this capitalist society, and the other is communist. Well, kind of the same thing happened in Korea with the Soviet Union putting in Kim Il-sung into North Korea. North Korea, of course, becomes very Soviet-friendly, communist, and then in South Korea becomes very pro-Western, and some would say even a vassal state of the West. You draw your own conclusions there, but there are certainly those who would say that. North Korea certainly says that about South Korea. Some South Koreans may even feel that they've become kind of a vassal of the U.S. And this is a very, very broad brush, but generally speaking, older Koreans tend to, there's kind of that cultural memory of the Korean War. And so they may be more appreciative of kind of the U.S. presence that is still on the peninsula than the younger generations. However, and maybe this is even paradoxical, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but it's also the older generations that would prefer reunification, because even you got to remember the two countries have been split now since 1945. So I mean they've been split for 80 years. They were split in 1945. The war happened 5 years later. So if you are 80 or younger, then you have not lived in the single country Korea, right? But you may still have that cultural memory there just from hearing your parents and your grandparents talk about it when it was all one country. And you may know that you have cousins on the other side. So that desire for reunification is stronger in the older generations than it is in the younger generations, which may look at the two countries, and I'm talking from the perspective of the South Koreans, that we're just too different. Like, we're two completely different countries. And to some degree, that's probably true. I mean, you have a culture that has been developed over thousands of years, but a lot has happened to kind of move the two countries in divergent directions over the last 80. Like that's true. Anyway, I'm not here to say whether they should or should or should not reunify, and that's a decision for North Koreans and South Koreans. But I do think that it's interesting to note the difficulties involved, and let's just name a couple real quick because this is interesting. If you think about Germany, so think about the economic disparity between East and West Germany, okay? Whatever that economic disparity was, it's nothing compared to the economic disparity between North and South Korea. Nothing. But here's the other thing. How long? So, I mean, East and West Germany were separated for 45 years, right? From the end of the war until the fall of the wall. 45 years. But the two Koreas have been separated for 80. And that's a big difference. But here's the kicker in my mind. This is the kicker. So East and West Germany never fought a war against each other. The North and South Koreans have fought a war against each other and have had a DMZ now for, 7 decades in running. And I realize, in Germany you had the Berlin Wall, but the Berlin Wall is not, it's not a DMZ. Now it was, hairy there for a while. And for those who don't know this, just remember that Berlin, the city of Berlin was entirely in East Germany. I think that gets forgotten, but remember, the city of Berlin entirely in East Germany. All right, look at a map if you don't believe me. It was not on the border between East and West Germany. All right, cool. So, important note that I haven't even gotten to yet because I keep going like from tangent to tangent. Okay, how do South Koreans refer to their country? What do South Koreans call their country? So they call it Hanguk, okay? Han meaning Korea, it's an old word, basically means Korea. And then Guk means like nation or country. So Korean nation, Korea country, that's basically how they refer to Korea. Now, quick note here. The Han that Koreans use is totally separate and distinct from like the Han Chinese. Okay. So that's separate. Don't get that confused. But so South Koreans call their country, for lack of a better word, they call it Korea. Okay. So how do South Koreans refer to North Korea? They call it Pukhan, Pukhan, which basically means like North Han, or in other words, like North Korea. So South Koreans call South Korea Korea. They call North Korea North Korea. You see the distinction there? So one is Korea, all of it, the whole peninsula, and the other is like there's a qualifier associated with it, Like we're the real Korea. Okay, well, the North Koreans do the exact same thing, but they don't call themselves Hanguk. Hanguk is how the South Koreans refer to their own country. From what I understand, the North Koreans use the word Joseon, which is like a much more traditional name. And you can look through the history of like the previous dynasties of Korea, etc. But so they refer to themselves as Joseon. Okay, so just kind of a different, more traditional name for Korea is what they use. But in essence, it's still Korea. They're still calling themselves Korea. And then what do they call South Korea? They say Nam Chosen, Nam Chosen, which literally means South Chosen. So South Korea. So again, note what I'm saying here. Each of the two countries refers to themselves as like the country, and then they use the qualifier North or South for the other, but not for their own. So it's like if you're in South Korea, it's Korea and North Korea. But if you're in North Korea, it's Korea and then there's South Korea. So anyway, very interesting perspective here. And again, it just goes back to each considers themselves to be the legitimate government for all of the Korean Peninsula. But by the way, if you're like an expert on Korean history or whatever, and I say something that you disagree with, or if I make a mistake and say something that's wrong here, then okay, cool. You got me. I'm not pretending to be an expert here. But I have spent 3 years in Korea, and I think what I'm saying here is, generally correct. Okay, the Korean people who have lived on the Korean Peninsula for thousands of years were liberated from Japan on August 15th, 1945, but divided into the Democratic South and the Communist North. Again, he mentioned South before North, which I think is funny and it's telling. I'm not saying that's wrong. Across the 38th parallel. By the way, I did know him. I didn't know Major General Sheen. I didn't know him super well, but I did work with him when he was on the Military Armistice Commission. I have no qualms. It seems like a good guy as far as I know. And I mean, I'm glad he wrote this little book. I don't know how you'd get a copy of it, but it is called The Korean Peninsula. It's called The Korean Peninsula Armistice to Peace. Again, not exactly sure how you would find a copy of it. I was given a copy, but cool little book. That's why I'm sharing it with you because maybe I don't know if you could get a copy, but so he says 66 years later in 2019, now that was 6 years ago, so now it would be 72 years later, the Republic of Korea has become a mature democracy with remarkable economic success. The Republic of Korea has evolved into a whole new and different country. So I don't think geopolitics is quite this simple, but if you want to do a case study in like capitalism versus communism, there are people who say just look at the Korean Peninsula and you'll see. Again, I don't think it's quite that simple. I think there are other factors at play, but I get the argument that people are making. I understand why you might say that. All right, so in response to the communist invasion of South Korea, an illegal act of aggression, the UN Security Council in New York adopted a series of UN resolutions. Number 82, meaning UN Resolution 82, demanding the cessation of the act of war, and number 84, authorizing the creation of a unified command. Based on this resolution, General MacArthur was appointed as the commander of the United Nations Command and given the operational control of the Republic of Korea, meaning South Korea, Army, Navy, and Air Force, based on then President Rhee's letter dated July 15, 1950. So Syngman Rhee, South Korean president, allowed for Korean forces to be kind of pulled up under the operational control of General MacArthur, the famed General Douglas MacArthur, in his role as United Nations commander. So what does that mean? So General MacArthur was the commander of all U.S. forces, but also all United Nations command forces as well. The United States was deemed kind of the executive agent of the United Nations for this war. All right. Okay, so a year into the war, on June 23rd, 1951, about a year after the outbreak of the Korean War, Soviet Foreign Minister Jacob Malik said in a UN broadcasting program titled The Price of Peace that the communist side was willing to negotiate the end of the Korean War. So it's interesting that came from the Soviet foreign minister. There are conflicting accounts as to how much the Soviets assisted North Korea during the war. So they did not put troops on the ground. Some people say they did assist in other ways. I've heard some people, and I've got some books over here that also say that there may have been Soviet pilots, that were flying. Remember, this is under Stalin. Stalin would die in 1953. So Stalin dies in the spring of 1953, maybe April. I can't remember exactly when he dies, but he dies in 1953, I think a couple of months before the armistice would be signed. So on June 30th, 1951, General Matthew Ridgway, the commander of UNC, United Nations Command, proposed a truce negotiation through a radio program. Okay, so MacArthur is the commander in June of 1950. Remember, MacArthur has that whole fallout with Truman. So MacArthur would be replaced by Ridgway, and then Ridgway would be replaced by Mark Clark. So that's how over the 3 years of the war, you go from MacArthur to Ridgway to Mark Clark. All right, the two sides held military discussions at the commander level on the following agenda: establishing a DMZ and an MDL, the military demarcation line, to cease hostilities, stopping combat, establishing measures to ensure implementation of the agreement, discussing prisoners of war, and convening a political meeting on withdrawal of foreign troops and a peaceful resolution to the Korean Peninsula issue. However, even today, a peaceful settlement of the Korean War through political discussions has yet to be achieved. The Armistice Agreement is a truce agreement. It is military in nature and designed to cease all hostilities until such time that a peaceful resolution to the Korean War is finally achieved. I would say it's a little bit more formal than a truce per se, but I have heard that word used to explain some of the talks. And this may be a translation issue too, but I would say the armistice is a little bit more formal than a truce, but it's not a peace treaty. All right, so he talks about some of the mechanics of how the military demarcation line and the DMZ were established in March. We're not going to read through that. It talks about how the Military Armistice Commission was created. So to fulfill all the obligations of the armistice, the Neutral Nation Supervisory Commission, the NNSC, and the Military Armistice Commission were established. The Military Armistice Commission oversees the DMZ and the HRE, which is the Han River Estuary, to prevent hostilities. And the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission monitors the movement of personnel and equipment. So basically what they would do is they would monitor like how foreign troops were going to leave the peninsula, you know? And ensure that no additional force entered. The Military Armistice Commission is a joint body between the United Nations Command and the Communist side, with a total of 10 senior officers from both sides, so 5 from each, without a chairperson. So what that means is there's no overall chairperson over both sides, because how would you pick a chairperson? Because which side would it come from? So it's just 2 sides of these senior delegates, 5 from each side that can come together and talk. And then each will have their supporting staffs, but it's 5 that are part of the actual commission, 5 from each side on the actual commission. And they would create, joint observation teams and create, communication channels between the 2 sides. I talked some about that in the last video. Okay. The Military Armistice Commission met at the Joint Security Area, which we talked about in the last video, in Panmunjom in the demilitarized zone at the request of either party. And they would meet in various different types of meetings. So there could be a Military Armistice Commission meeting, a secretary meeting. So the secretary is below the level of the Military Armistice Commission. There would be a colonel who would have a staff called the Secretariat that directly supports the Military Armistice Commission. So the secretary, that colonel on each side that leads the secretariat that directly supports the Military Armistice Commission, those guys could meet, staff officers could meet, etc. Whenever an armistice violation occurred, the commission meeting was held and would last for several hours, but usually to no avail, as the 2 sides would stick to their positions and refute claims by the other side. Well, I at least like that he's being honest there and not trying to pin all the blame on North Korea, saying, hey, both sides sometimes would be unwilling to, compromise at all, etc. Yeah, fair enough. So what's called UNCMAC is the acronym that we would often use. UNCMAC, United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. So this is the United Nations Command side of the Military Armistice Commission. UNCMAC is composed of members from the United States, the Republic of Korea, meaning South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the sending states, which would mean one of the other countries that sent people to South Korea, during the hostilities, and may still have some troops in South Korea, etc., or still have people that are stationed, on the peninsula. The position of the senior member of, which is a 2-star, the senior member of the Military Armistice Commission was held by a U.S. general officer after the signing of the armistice. But it was transferred to a Korean 2-star general in 1991. And this pissed off the North Koreans. So the Military Armistice Commission would have a couple of 2-stars, a couple of 1-stars, and typically a colonel. And it'd be the same thing on the other side, except on the other side, you'd have North Koreans, but you would have maybe like one general representing the CPV for a time. And then the Chinese stopped as well. But so when the senior member, so the ranking guy on the United Nations Command side of the Military Armistice Commission, when it became a South Korean as opposed to a U.S. officer, the North Koreans got upset. Why? So the KPA, Korean People's Army, meaning North Koreans, / CPV, Military Armistice Commission stated it was unacceptable to have a South Korean general officer as the senior member, as South Korea was unofficially opposed to signing the Armistice Agreement and didn't even exercise operational control over its forces. Now, remember, Syngman Rhee had given operational control of the forces during the war to the United States. And Syngman Rhee, no South Koreans signed the armistice. So what the North Koreans and the representative from the CPV are saying is the Military Armistice Commission, the senior member on your side of the Military Armistice Commission has to be a U.S. officer. You guys are puppets of the U.S. is basically what they're saying. We don't want to talk to you. We want to talk to the U.S. guys. And I'm not saying they wouldn't talk to any South Koreans, but they want it's very interesting. They want the ranking member on the Military Armistice Commission to be a U.S. guy. So anyway, so the Military Armistice Commission on the North Korean side threatened that they would basically cease their functions on their side. So the communist side of the Military Armistice Commission consisted of KPA and Chinese delegations. However, in 1991, with the appointment of a South Korean general as the senior member of the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission, the communist side refused to attend Military Armistice Commission meetings and continued to undermine the Military Armistice Commission with an ultimate goal to dismantle the armistice. So that's strong language there. So anyway, they basically, their side of the Military Armistice Commission became defunct. But it doesn't end there. So what happened? We're going to talk about what happened with the NNSC too. So in April of 1991, all this happened in March and April of 1991, North Korea stated that the NNSC, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, had made no tangible contribution whatsoever to resolving armistice issues on the Korean Peninsula. This is in 91. The armistice was signed in 53. So this is almost 40 years later. And therefore had no reason to exist anymore. It was because the NNSC failed to prevent the appointment of a South Korean general officer as the senior member of the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. Since then, North Korea has continued to argue that the NNSC has no use. After the split of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic, I mentioned this earlier, and Slovakia in April of 1993, North Korea refused to acknowledge the Czech Republic as an NNSC delegation. So here's what happened. Czechoslovakia splits into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, right? Well, it was specifically Czechoslovakia that had been chosen by, North Korea to be part of the NNSC. The Czech Republic said, we can continue that mission that Czechoslovakia used to have. North Korea said no. So they denied any delegates from the Czech Republic into North Korea to continue the mission. In February 1995, North Korea forcefully deported the Polish delegation from the NNSC as well. And wouldn't let them enter in. So although the NNSC activities on the communist side came to a halt by the Swiss and Swedish delegations of the NNSC on the they have continued to operate on the United Nations Command side. Okay, so here's what we're saying here. So he's saying the two nations that have been picked by the North Koreans, so their mission was discontinued. One, because Czechoslovakia ceases to be a country. Czech Republic wants to continue that mission. And North Korea says no, because North Korea was like, the NNSC hasn't accomplished anything anyway. And look what's going on over there on the other side of the Military Armistice Commission. They're violating the armistice by putting a South Korean member as the senior member of their side of the commission. NNSC allowed this to happen. So what have you guys done? You're out of here. So they say, no, Czech Republic, we don't need you anymore. Don't care that you want to continue and do what Czechoslovakia had done previously. We don't need you. And oh, by the way, they say to the Polish, get out of here. But the Swiss and the Swedes remained. And so the Swiss and the Swedes would perform their functions on the United Nations Command side of the the DMZ, and they would try to perform functions on the other side, and the North Koreans would say no. So although the NNSC activities on the communist side came to a halt, the Swiss and Swedish delegations have continued operations on the United Nations Command side since 1953. Furthermore, the Polish delegation, which was forced to leave North Korea, visits South Korea on a quarterly basis to attend NNSC meetings on the UNC side, as per its policy to continue to honor its NNSC mission. Okay, that's all we're going to read. So that's a lot. That's a lot. And some of you are probably, if you're even still listening, are like, whoa, what is all this? So I know that's a lot. But if you're at all interested in this stuff, and there are many reasons why you should be, that's kind of why I wanted to give you some context you're probably not aware of. So the Korean War is typically called the Forgotten War. Why? Because it's in between, and therefore it kind of gets left out of the conversations because it gets lost in between World War II and Vietnam. But it should not be the Forgotten War because, first of all, we lost a lot of troops. It was very large in scope. And it was the first real hot manifestation of the Cold War. And then also because it still continues to this day. And we still have a troop presence over there on the Korean Peninsula to this day. Technically, the war still goes on, even though we never actually even. So we haven't gotten to a peace treaty. Technically, we're kind of still at war with North Korea, even though we never actually declared war in the first place. Remember, the Korean War was billed as a police action. That's kind of how it was sold back home to the American public. So all of this is still going on. Now there's the whole nuclear question with, the nukes that supposedly, Kim Jong-un has. So Kim Jong-un is the son of Kim Jong-il, who is the son of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is the one who signed the armistice. So he was the first leader of North Korea after the split, right? Both Korean governments believe themselves to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. And even in the way that they refer to the other, that's kind of why I went through and allowed you to maybe just have a peek into the psychology of both sides when it comes to that. I don't claim to be an expert here. If I got something wrong or there's something here that maybe you're more of an expert on this than I am, so make a video and I'll watch it. But I do think this is fascinating, and I'm glad that I spent time in Korea because it was a very unique assignment, and I've had a couple unique assignments, during the time in which I was in the military. But it opened up my aperture to see things that maybe a lot of military officers don't. That said, you guys know all the time that I say that the military framework, you can use the military framework to try and understand a lot of things, but there's some baggage you got to get rid of, though, to see things accurately. If you only see things through a very simplistic geopolitical construct, then I think you're going to get things wrong. So I don't know what's going on with North Korea. I feel very bad for the North Korean people. I feel very bad for, people anywhere that suffer. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going on with North Korea or whether it is being maintained for some eventual trigger for the next large war. I have no idea. I do know that there are people who say maybe that's why it's been allowed to remain as a nuclear power. I don't know. Obviously, a lot of power projection into that area from the part of the West is not so much about North Korea as it is, Russia, China, et cetera. I mean, it's very obvious. I think most people kind of realize that. So it's an interesting part of the world. And I do think that if you kind of understand what's going on there, it'll help you appreciate more of what's happening around the world, but also potentially as tensions maybe go on escalating between the East and the West. So why did I go through and explain like the Military Armistice Commission and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission? Well, it's near and dear to me because I spent so much time over there dealing with that. But I also find it fascinating. And I don't know where you're going to hear about that stuff because that stuff is super important. But a lot of times it gets lost in the day to day discussions about what's going on in Korea or even U.S. South Korea relations or U.S. North Korea relations, etc. But I'm just trying to give you a little bit more of a perspective on the armistice, the day to day maintenance of the armistice from someone who was there and lived that for a couple of years. Yeah, but I'm not saying that there's not something else at play there that I haven't seen. I don't know. I was there for 3 years and asked myself that question quite frequently and never came to a suitable answer as to what exactly is going on. But for me, I don't want a massive war on the Korean Peninsula. I don't want a war anywhere. I have a large heart for the South Korean people, and I also have a lot of sympathy for the North Korean people as well. And anytime you're in a situation like that, you don't have to look at people from any of these nations and think like, oh, that person is my enemy. There are people here in this country that are much more my enemy than your average North Korean citizen, you know? There are people in our own country that are in DC that want to do harm to everyday Americans, much more so than everyday North Koreans want to do harm to everyday Americans, despite the propaganda that they supposedly hear every day. So, yeah, we don't have to view people as our enemies. And it's important that we take a nuanced view to these things. I'm not excusing North Korea's actions. I'm not here to say that, the Kim family are good guys. I think they're horrible guys. Um, um, and I'm also not here to say that they're not a threat. Anyway, so all right, appreciate it. Hope you got something out of the video. Thank you.